Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Shawna Pandya. We are so excited to talk with you today. For our listening audience, can you share a little bit about who you are? I know there's so many roles that you play, so I know that you wear many different hats, but how you got to be involved in space?
Yeah, I like to say that every day in my life is like a box of medical chocolates. You never know what you're going to get, or probably more accurately, a box of space medical chocolates. So I'm a Canadian physician. I am the director of the International Institute for Astronautical Sciences Space Medicine Group. I'm an aquanaut, pilot in training, skydiver, scientist-astronaut candidate with IIAS, as well as the lead instructor for the IIAS Space Medicine course. And I'm also the VP of Immersive Medicine with Luxsonic Technologies, fellow of the Explorers Club, as well as a medical advisor to several space companies, including Astrius, which is a space food company, as well as medical strategic research advisor to Above Space Development Corporation. So it's
That
a
is
lot,
a
but,
lot.
but it keeps life interesting.
I bet. I'm like just listening to some of those. I'm like space food, right? Like that just sounds super exciting to be at the table when you're talking about something like that. Did you start loving space early on, or is it something that you just kind of came into as a doctor?
Yeah, so for me, the space dream started with the way it does with a lot of kids. I was a kid who wanted to be an astronaut, and I simply never grew out of that dream. I grew up in the 1990s when Canada's first ever female astronaut, Dr. Roberta Bondar, flew to space. And I said, oh my gosh, I want to do what she does. So I thought, well, she's Canadian, I'm Canadian, she's female, I'm female, she's a girl guide, I'm a girl guide. So now all I need to do is be a neuroscientist physician, and then I can be an astronaut. And so literally, that's why I decided to pursue neuroscience and then medicine. And then somewhere along the way, I found out that people make entire careers out of space medicine, this concept of keeping astronauts healthy. And surviving and thriving in space flight. So I started looking at internships and research around that. I did my master's at the International Space University. There I was lucky enough to intern at the European Astronaut Center's Crew Medical Support Office. And then that's when I really realized I can be a part of research that is critical to keeping astronauts productive and healthy while they're up in space.
So, for our listeners, what are some of those issues that astronauts face from a medical aspect?
Yeah, so the one line summary is that space is trying to kill you. Getting more into the weeds into that. When we talk about the challenges of space flight, we talk about the big five. So there's radiation, distance from Earth, isolation, confinement. There's the hostile environment aspect of it. So that can be anything from lunar dust on the moon to altered day-night cycles. So when you're at the level of the International Space Station, you are experiencing one sunrise sunset cycle at a rate of every 90 minutes. So that's 16 sunrise sunset cycles every 24 hours. So as you can imagine, that may flip your circadian rhythm or your day-night cycle upside down. It may interfere with sleep. And then, of course, there's the big thing that we all think about when we talk about the spaceflight environment, which is, of course, microgravity, weightlessness, zero G. And so the summary for that is that every single bodily system is affected by the spaceflight environment. So our bones lose density, our muscles lose mass, our fluids shift upwards, our brain juice, that cerebrospinal fluid that surrounds and cushions and bathes our brains and spines, that doesn't drain as well, creating increased pressure on the optic nerves at the back of our eyes. So there's a lot going on and a lot that we need to talk about mitigating to keep astronauts being able to perform up in space.
And that is
Yes. So I know we've just met recently, but I'm a biochemist by training. And so my gateway drug to space was I wanted to fly osteoblasts in vitro cultures because, you know, the unloading of the skeletal system and muscle atrophy and disuse degeneration. I always thought that was very fascinating how the normal bone life cycles get decoupled, without that skeletal loading. And we don't even think about that. Right now, we're holding our heads up. We don't even think that we're resisting gravity here just by sitting upright. And yet the astronauts, I hear stories, and maybe you can elaborate on their like loss of fine motor skills with like balance, and it's like the little muscles, even though they're exercising for hours. Maybe you can elaborate on that a little.
There is so much that we take for granted, having the luxury of growing up in 1G. And so when we talk about balance, it's actually this finely coordinated dance between our vestibular systems in our ears, between what our eyes see, and then what these proprioceptors, these little neuronal organelles, do to perceive where our bodies are in space. And so typically, you know, they're all in sync in 1G. And then when we're in the 0G environment, there is this mismatch between what our eyes perceive as up and down versus what our inner ears perceive as up and down, and then where our bodies are used to being in space versus where they actually are. And one way to kind of recreate that in a very quick and easy way is just to take out one of those inputs here in 1G. And so if you've never done this before, you can close your eyes and then say, touch your nose. I've done this so many times that I now know where my nose is. But the first time I tried this, a lot of people missed it.
Go to
Like,
the side.
yeah, they poke themselves in the eye. And so it's you know, it's those inputs you know, are taken away from their baseline in the microgravity environment. And in fact, that mismatch can lead to the spaceflight adaptation syndrome and nausea, vomiting, and being just intractably sick for the first 24 to 72 hours on station.
I had the privilege of flying several times with students on 0G. Tell us about some of your work on 0G, because that had to have been a lot of fun, right?
Yeah, I have been lucky enough to participate, I think, in 10 parabolic flight campaigns now. 9 of those have been research flights, over 163 parabolas to date. And I have been lucky enough to perform a host of experiments, everything from testing IVA or intravehicular activity spacesuits in microgravity to advance their technology readiness level, to biometric sensors that have never been tested in microgravity before, to testing how they interact with the spacesuit, to look at the signal to noise ratio, just to help prepare the Canadian Space Agency astronauts who would later wear that on station. We did that in 2018 for one of the biomonitoring devices that David Saint-Jacques wore. And then we've also tested virtual reality imaging payloads in space, that in the hopes that it may someday be used by astronauts. And then we've also done non-medical things as well, non-human performance things as well. We have tested, oh gosh, there's a long list. Fluid cell experiments with one of the lead scientists at IIAS. So Dr. Aaron Prasad, his PhD and life's work is in fluid thermodynamics. So we've tested that for him. We've done rotating body experiments just to see how different shapes, how their physics of rotation is altered in microgravity environments. So the list goes on and on. You know, it never gets old. It's impossible to be in 0G in a spacesuit and not have a giant smile on your face.
Right. One last question. Let's say you're on the ISS, you've got an unconscious astronaut. What's your preference for an IV? What artery are you immediately going, is your go-to artery? Is it in the leg? Is it in the arm? Where would you, what would, if you had to administer some first aid and you're the physician on the station, has any of your training prepared you, say, to work through a checklist or something with that respect?
Yeah, so when we talk about the order of operations for a critically ill patient, that doesn't change whether you're talking about microgravity or the spaceflight environment. You're still looking at ABCs, airway, breathing, circulation, and the caveat ahead of that is mass hemorrhage. So you always want to address those things. Just a little bit more challenging in the spaceflight environment. So the short answer for an IV is you're looking for the vein that you will give you the access you want for what you want to do. So is it a vein that you can insert medications into it? So the difference is a peripheral vein versus a central line. And is it one that will not blow on you, that won't roll on you, that you know that you can insert an IV into? So the nice thing is the principle of space IVs is the same as Earth IVs.
So I'm going to pivot a little bit and ask you about aquanauting, right? I'm not sure if I'm saying aquanaut, right? So is that to prepare you? I mean, I know that you're considering, or at least when we met you, Janet said that you're going to be the next astronaut. So is that something that all astronauts actually undergo? Is the idea of being an aquanaut as well, or is that a separate field?
Yes, is the short answer. So the answer is both. So My austere and expedition experience has taken me to many analog environments, by which I mean they are in some way analogous to the spaceflight environment, and underwater habitats have been some of them. And so that's where my foray into the underwater aquanauting world came into. And for those who don't know, an aquanaut is someone who lives at saturation and is breathing the ambient air pressure for at least 24 hours. So I've been lucky enough to do 2 aquanaut missions, one in 2019, one just last month, where we took part in the Neptune or nautical experiments in physiology, technology, and underwater exploration missions. And basically, we're doing all these experiments around science, around healthcare, around technology demonstrations, using virtual reality, using imaging, using looking at our stress parameters, looking at cortisol. And the idea is both in that to prepare us for living in working in an isolated, confined environment, because that's one of the stressors of space. So in my case, it's both been a case of wanting to prepare for spaceflight, but also just falling in love with the expedition world and ocean exploration in particular. And all of these missions have been incredible. And they've honestly felt too short, and I would do it again in a heartbeat.
Where you off the Florida Keys, where was it about 33 feet of water? Is that
Yeah,
the
there's two. Yeah, you got it. There's 2 famous habitats in the Florida Keys. So the one we did our mission at is called the Jules Undersea Lodge. That's at 22 feet of depth. And that's where actually one of my crewmates, the commander of that mission, just finished his 100-day underwater mission.
Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah, on June 9th. So I was lucky enough to be part of the supporting medical team that oversaw his exit this past Friday. And then also in the Florida Keys is the Aquarius Research Base, the Aquarius Reef Base, excuse me, where NASA sends its astronauts to become aquanauts, and they take part in missions of 8 to 16 days at a time to learn about the same things, about crew dynamics, about underwater exploration, performing their version of an EVA in this isolated, confined environment, and also to perform some cool science and technology demonstrations. So NEMO stands for NASA Extreme Environment Mission Operations. That's what the NASA Aquanaut missions are called. And NEMO or Aquarius Reef Base is at 60 feet of depth. So the big difference is once you're in saturation at 60 feet of depth, you have to decompress for 16 hours and 47 minutes before you can safely surface. Otherwise, you risk getting a dive injury, you risk getting bubbles lodging where they shouldn't. And so it's kind of cool because this really is a good analog for spaceflight, because in the event of a very critical emergency, you could evacuate from the ISS in as little as 3 to 6.5 hours and get back on Earth and to medical care ostensibly, depending on what your trajectory is. So you could actually get to definitive medical care from space more quickly than from the Aquarius Reef Base. So it kind of becomes apparent why this is a good preparatory analog for spaceflight.
Especially with isolation, right? Especially from the aspect of isolation.
Yeah, you have to play nice with your crewmates. If you have a fight, you can't just go have a stroll outside to clear your head. It's a very confined place. Both these places, Aquarius is about the size of a school bus. You'll have 6 people living there in a time. Jules is about 100 square feet approximately. And again, when we were down there were 5 of us living there. So again, you're really practicing these principles of what NASA and the National Outdoor Leadership School call expeditionary behavior.
Did you have any time lags built into the comms to simulate, the time difference between, say, a deep space mission or a Mars mission that would be crewed versus, say, the 1-second moon delay?
Yeah, that's a great question. On the Neptune missions, we practiced real-time comms, so just as if we were on the ISS. I've done 2 Mars Desert Research Station or Mars simulation tours, and those would never have real-time communications, would not use instant messaging at all. I would simply correspond by email, which was actually really cool because I know there's this perception of, how do you handle being away from your family, your friends, your loved ones? But in certain cases, for example, with my best friends and previous expedition mates, we grew closer because we would just write these long letters to each other and have these constant correspondences. And from my previous missions, there's email threads 80 messages long, just by deepening those connections.
That might be interesting, like to study over time if whether the relationships actually build or become closer with the distance because of exactly what you're saying. Like you're actually probably spending more time communicating than you might normally. Like we just sometimes forget to reconnect with each other.
Yeah, definitely. In my case, anecdotally, for sure, with my mom, I always want to let her know she's top of mind. So her birthday fell during my first aquanaut mission. So I had a birthday card down there underwater with me that I brought specifically for her. I sent her a message, a video with it. And then in fact, I had my entire crew sing her happy birthday, which they were all really good sports about. And then I had a parabolic flight campaign the following week. So I also flew that card 0G for her. And then this time, I'm probably giving the impression that I'm not a very good daughter. I'm always away. But it was Mother's Day on the second aquanaut mission. So again, I brought her a Mother's Day card. I brought it underwater with me, sent her a video message. So it's, you can deepen these connections by letting your loved ones know they're top of mind. It was actually really cool. I would call friends and loved ones and give them a virtual tour of our.
Right, they're being they're part of it because you're bringing them into your life there, especially with the videos. And I'm sure she's so proud of you. I mean, she must be beside herself.
It's incredibly special to bring your loved ones into this isolated world, this expeditionary world, and say, hey, I'm living underwater. Do you want to look out the window with me? Do you want to see the fish swimming by? So you can help share that really unique experience. And I think that's a pretty special shared memory that we're forging here.
For sure.
Growing up, did you live in a rather secluded place in Canada? There's some very desolate places in Canada, or did you grow up as a sort of a city kid who happens to enjoy being out, exploring?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was born in Brandon, Manitoba, which is rural Canada. I'm not sure what made my parents move from warm, balmy tropical India to -35 Celsius in Canada in the middle of winter. I moved to a suburban area in Sherwood Park, Alberta when I was 1 year old, and that's been home base ever since. But the corollary to that is I have always been very outdoorsy. My parents have been adventurous. They took us camping from the time we were 2. I was a Girl Guide from age 7. Yeah, age 6 or 7 up until the time I was 14. I always did outdoor ed in junior high. So we would go do things like build lean-tos. So, a lot of my life was outdoors, camping, canoeing. There's a lot of great outdoors here in Canada.
Girl Guide, like analogous to scouting?
Yeah. Sorry, that's the Canadian translation is, so the Girl Guide movement within the Commonwealth, there are UK chapters and Canadian chapters of Girl Guides, but it's analogous to being a Girl Scout. We sell our cookies and our Thin Mints, and I would do a lot of that growing up as well. But we got to do cool things like every year we would go camping, and then as we became more senior, we would plan camping trips for. When I was 14, I took a 6-year-old and a 7-year-old camping for the weekend. And it was up to us to plan their activity program, plan the meal, So you're from the very early age, you're not only learning outdoorsmanship, outdoorswomanship, but also sharing that love and bringing others and teaching it to others as well.
Sure.
Like a mentor.
Like a pathfinder.
Yeah.
So
and literally that's what we were called at the junior high stage. We were brownies, then Girl Guides, then pathfinders, and then rangers.
Yes, that's very paramilitary sounding. So question, as a future, let's be very positive and proactive here, as a future Canadian astronaut, what is the Canadian Space Agency looking for? What are the ideal traits that they're looking for? Because we're sort of past the days of, married experimental jet pilots being the only types of astronauts. So what from your position and your perspective, what are the ideal characteristics of the next Canadian astronauts?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've been very fortunate to have some amazing astronaut mentors. And so just watching them, you see that there's this mentality they have. And when I talk about the astronaut mentality, these are folks who are very, very smart, very good at what they do, but also able to pick up a huge array of skills across multiple domains. They have a good attitude. They're looking for ways to fill in the gaps. They're looking for ways to support the team. And the most important part is when you sit down with them, they make you really feel that you're just on their level, and they make you feel like you're an explorer along with them. And for me, that's what it means to encapsulate and really live that astronaut mentality. And I really hope that's something that I can embody as well as I progress through my space career.
Cool. I have to ask, I know it's going to be funny, but how's your guitar playing?
You know, my guitar playing is rusty, but what I do play piano as well as sing. So one cool experiment I did with the aquanaut mission, I was curious as to if my vocal pitch and tone would be different at pressure. So I kind of sang this riff from Queen, Somebody to Love, both at surface pressure and at 1.6 atmospheres. And it sounded pretty much the same. But definitely music has always been part of my life. Right now, I would say my guitar skills are pretty much limited to Wonderwall by Oasis. So maybe I should work on that.
Well,
That's a good one though. If you got
right.
one to go to, that's
And for our listeners, obviously, I'm making a Chris Hadfield reference, right? Because
Yeah, exactly.
is he not Superman in Canadian space terms? Is he pretty much like, I mean, he's very well known, right? He's just a
Yeah.
well-known astronaut, not just a Canadian astronaut.
He is
But
an astronaut's astronaut. And, you know, when I talk about the astronaut mentality, that's exactly, you know, one of the folks I'm referring to. I was lucky enough to intern at NASA's Johnson Space Center on an aerospace medical elective in my 4th year of medical school. And they said, yeah, we'll get the Canadian astronauts who are training down there to liaise with you. And this was sponsored by the Canadian Space Agency. And you're thinking, well, that's really nice of you to say, CSA, but they're astronauts. They have better things to do. And sure enough, my first day there, my phone in my office rings, and the guy on the other end says, hey, it's Lieutenant Colonel Chris Hadfield. Do you want to come for coffee with myself and the other medical students? And you're like, is this even
yeah,
real?
like no, what?
You know, he just made so much time for us. And this was when he was training to be commander of the International Space Station. He's a busy guy, but he was just so giving with his time. He was just so encouraging. He was just so open about his own journey as a Canadian into the astronautics world. And so that's what I really mean when you're speaking with folks who are just at the top of their game, but also really making you believe that you can be there too. So, you know, I hope I can be that for others as I go through my career.
I am sure that you will. And as we kind of get to that end, that's always where I kind of like want to ask that question. I think about, you know, it's sometimes hard to get girls interested or to understand that they have even the possibilities out there. What would you say to some of our girl listeners, specifically the ladies out there who might be interested and have never maybe even seen themselves as an astronaut?
Yeah, so what I like to say is that there's space for all of us. So if you think that you were interested in the space field, figure out in space exploration, you don't, you know, the face of who we need in space is constantly evolving. If you are a storyteller, if you're an artist, if you're a journalist, if you're a lawyer, we still need you and your expertise in space. So figure out what your area of passion and expertise is, become really good at it, and then seek your own path. But there's definitely space for all of us.
Be a pathfinder even there, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Anything you want to add? I know we're kind of to the end of our time, but
I think we may ask you back down the road to maybe do a follow-up
especially with the students, I would think should be
episode. Yes,
amazing.
as your career progresses, it would be nice to catch up with you. I have lots of questions, but I'll save a few of mine for all.
Well, and I'm thinking too about some of the students we work with, particularly who are interested in the medical, you know, like looking at astronauts and what's happening to them, not only psychologically or medically, but maybe if that's something you're available to do, some students may reach out to you because they've been working on some research with that. So it'd be great to have somebody in the field who
Right.
could help them out.
Right.
Well, we really appreciate your time today. We look forward to hearing from you in the future, and we look forward to watching you launch one day as well.
Well, thank you so much for your time, both of you. And yes, I definitely look forward to a round 2 someday.
Thank you.